Welcome to the Be Dadly podcast, where we discuss all things dadly, from being an entrepreneur while caring for toddlers to raising screenagers and talking the birds and the bees. We're here to help you traverse the vast and dynamic landscape of fatherhood. Enjoy practical advice, lots of puns, and even a few heart-touching moments.
And the dad jokes are pretty good too.
And now your host, Brandon Jones.
And just like that, we are back, folks. Welcome back to the Be Dadly podcast. I'm Brandon Jones, your host. And I just want to say I have this incredible guest today. He's getting to do something that is very unique, and we're going to get a lot out of it. He is doing dadding twice. This man has already successfully raised children, 3 children, 27, 25, and 23. And now he's doing it over again. He now has an 8-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a almost 1-year-old. And so we're going to hear, what is the difference when you're a father again, right? If you could do it over, what would that be like? What's different? What's the same? What do you stick with, etc.? And that's something that we're going to get in today with Jerod. Jerod has a unique perspective because he's having the opportunity to raise a whole new family again. And so we're going to dig into that today. Before we do, please do like and subscribe. It really, really, really helps this small channel out and helps us reach more fathers. Also, if you're willing to share us with others, man, that would just be awesome. And just thank you for being here and enjoy the show. Jerod Norden, thank you for your time, brother. We're really grateful to have you on the show.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I appreciate it. If I've learned anything doing this more than once, I'm happy to share, I guess.
Awesome. So tell me about this. First of all, you have a family and you raised a 27-year-old, 25-year-old, 23-year-old. And how did this happen where now you have another set of kids and you're doing it over?
Well, I joined, so I was in the military. I just retired not too long ago. But I joined when I was 19 and I got married right out of high school, and we got to our first duty station and had babies, like, most people probably in the military do when they get married young. And then I watched them grow up. I got to move around. They got to experience a lot of moving, and the challenges of growing up in the military. And then, we got divorced amicably, just 6 years ago, I guess. I got remarried, and my wife had a daughter already. So I gained my bonus, my stepdaughter, who's 8. And then one day out of the blue, my wife asked me if I wanted to have more kids. And I said, absolutely. I always figured when my older 3 grew up, I'd be like my dad. I'd be an empty nester and go golf or something. But then I realized that I really love doing the dad thing. I love being with my kids. That's my biggest hobby. Pretty much. I don't really do anything else, I guess, other than go to work and play with my kids. So I was all in when we did that. So we had to go to fertility for my 3-year-old, and we didn't think it was going to work. And then out of the blue, and we had given up, and we thought, well, we're just not going to have more kids. We had a 3-year-old, and then a couple years later, we thought we'd try one more time, and then without any help at all, we had my son, and then we're done. Like six is enough. I do 2 sets of 3. I can't do more than that. So
right.
And so my wife is still in the military, so these 3 kind of get to see a little bit of it, but they won't have to grow up with that whole environment. So.
Mm-hmm. So tell me real quick, when you first became a father, what was that journey like? The first round.
Oh man, I used to joke. So I used to joke that I put more thought and effort into thinking about whether or not I want to have a puppy than I ever did about having a kid. My first wife and I, we did the same thing. Like, hey, you want to have a kid? I'm like, yeah, let's try this. And so we had my oldest daughter, and it was rough. I mean, I love it. I loved every minute of it with my older 3. But it was hard being a young kid. I didn't have probably a lot of really good parenting. I had my grandparents who raised me for much of my youth. To look back on, but they were very traditionalist. And so that's kind of how I raised those 3 kids. I was very we sit at the table, we clean the rooms and very structured. And that kind of led me down to fighting a lot or being angry a lot more than I am now, where I've kind of decided to just throw all that out the window. How
old were you?
I was 19, 20. I just turned 20. when
Okay.
my daughter was born. And
Yeah.
then we had them every 2 years after that. So,
So you're 20 years old. You decide you guys have your first kid. It just made sense, right? Like you're in the military, you're married, you're ready to go, and you have the kids, and you have these values, these traditional values that were instilled in you from your grandparents, and you're like, this is how you raise a kid. You do this, and you're strict, and the house must look like that, and dinners
oh
must look
yeah,
like this. And
yes.
now you're saying round two, you're like, I don't know if that's really important.
Well, you and I talked before, and I was thinking
Yeah.
about it afterwards. I was like, a lot of times I think we get trapped. I was into this structure of all we know is what we've grown up with. And my grandparents were awesome. They were amazing. They were amazing people. But they were strict. My grandmother, especially, she was very strict. And we sat down and we ate at dinner time, and we ate what was on our plate. I was talking with a friend the other day about my grandma would make liver and onions, and she'd make tongue because it was cheap meat.
Yeah.
And I remember we'd be sitting there till 10 o'clock at night, like a power, this test of wills over I'm not eating and she's going to make sure I eat. And it wasn't until years later I thought, well, why as a parent would I do that to myself? I mean, I'm like, I want my evenings when I come home from work to be peaceful and fun. And why would I purposely make something I know is just going to be a test of wills all night long? And it kind of drove me into a lot of that stuff of why do I stress about things that I used to stress about? Like, oh no, the kids' rooms have to be cleaned, and no, you made a mess with your art stuff, and I realized none of that stuff really mattered. It took away from enjoying, and I was only doing it because that's all I knew, because that's all I had ever seen at that when I was young, and so that it was just kind of I was just rinsing and repeating what had happened before me, which is probably what they were doing and their parents did, and a lot of that stuff, and especially as I started having the second set of three, I didn't want to do that anymore. I call it, I told you last time, I was like, I kind of call this free range parenting now. I kind of like, I don't stress about it. Like if they sit at a table and they're like, I'm not really hungry. I'm like, all right, well, that's cool. Like, I'm not going to sit here and force you to eat. Like, what does that gain anything? Like, it doesn't really gain anything. If they're not hungry, forcing them to eat is counterproductive. And same with a lot of things.
And what's so fascinating is studies show like the kids will actually continue to be picky eaters the more you try to force them, which is really interesting. It becomes actually a source of their own power. And it can be a negative source of power where it's like they now have power that doesn't even, if it didn't matter, they don't get to absorb this strength, this sense of power. But when you do make it matter, now they have some sense of authority that is almost like a reason to fight, and it's really interesting. I encourage parents, don't force your kids to eat. At the same time, if they choose not to eat, they're going to go hungry. Like, don't give them tons of snacks and like all, it's not like, hey, you didn't want to eat your dinner, so you can go eat the donuts out of the pantry. No, that's not really going to work either. It's more like you choose not to eat this. You're going hungry for a little while until we go to our next meal.
Natural consequences.
Right. The natural consequence. Right. Exactly. And that generally works a lot better than trying to force stuff down your throat. And I grew up, you had to have literally a glass of milk. It was the weirdest thing. We had to have this glass of milk next to our food. And we had to eat all of our food and drink that glass of milk. And it always made me want to vomit. I was like, why do I have to drink? And why am I drinking milk at dinner? My grandparents were especially strict about that. And it was a very interesting, like, where did this come from that we have to have our glass of milk with our dinner? And it's so interesting.
That's fascinating about the pickiness, because my older three are super picky, even today as in their 20s. And it's funny in range of age. Like my oldest is really picky, and then my second daughter, the youngest of the three, she's much more open to exploring, which is probably when I started.
Right, you started relaxing
parenting habits. But then these three kids will eat anything. Like we'll make, because my wife is Asian, we'll make Korean ribs or whatever, and they love them. They'll eat them to death, and that's fascinating. That
it's really backwards. And so that's what's interesting. Some of this parenting is so counterintuitive. Like you think, if I force them to be, to eat a variety of foods, then that's what they're going to do. But if it becomes a source of like awful contention where you're just constantly fighting over the meal, then the child gets this hit of power that they can actually, like you said, it was a test of wills. And then it becomes like, And what you realize as a parent, just like you've realized, like you can't change your kids as much as you want to force broccoli down their throat. You can't force them to like it. Even if you could force them to eat it, you can't force them to like it. So what's your goal? Is your goal to force a child to eat something, or is it to get them to open their variety up? And there's a really fascinating thing regarding food, which is that the more exposures a child has to food, so the variety of foods, and exposures doesn't mean they have to eat it. It means they can smell it, lick it, taste it, pass it, play with it, color it, throw it, do whatever with it. But the more exposure they have to the variety of food, the bigger their palate will become. And so that's a really interesting thing where it's like, hey, you don't want to eat that, pass it on over here. And I've got a great personal testimony of that where I learned that, and I was like, okay, I'm definitely, because my first kid, I was like, you got to try everything and whatever. And I was kind of a lot like you. I call my first son Sandpaper because by the time I got to my other one, he had polished off all the corners of me. I was not rigid hardly at all. And I remember my oldest being like, "You're not as strict as you are on him." I'm like, "You wore me down. If you know,
this is your fault, not my fault. You had a
part in this." But yeah. So I'm passing. I learned that if the more exposures, and I learned this idea that, let's say a child doesn't want to eat the food, so you put a portion of all the food on their plate, but it could be as small as a teaspoon, just as long as a portion is on their plate, because that's an exposure, right? So when they say they don't want to eat it, you can correct their language. Instead of them saying, "Ew, gross," you would say something like, "That's not your favorite." And you would just give them framework to be able to tell somebody else, "That's not my favorite thing." So you give them a different piece of language. And you also can say, and this is really a little mind trick here, is you say, "I see you're still learning to eat broccoli." Now, we all remember when we were little kids, but like, no, I'm not still learning. I know. So they shove it in their mouth. Like, I know how to do this. I'm not learning.
Don't tell me.
Yeah, exactly. So now the power is flipped where they're like, "No, I'll prove to you. I'm not still learning this. I know how to eat this." I'm like,
that's funny.
Okay. So I said to my son, "I see you're still learning asparagus. Would you mind feeding daddy?" And he was like, "Wait, I can feed you?" And so he loved that little role reversal. And then he starts giving me the asparagus, and he's feeding me the asparagus. And pretty soon I'd cut up some more and pass it to him to feed me because he was enjoying the game so much. And then after a few bites, he put some in his own mouth. And every other bite, he was taking a bite. And I kicked his mother under the table. I said, "Look at this. Look." And she looks over and she's like, her jaw is unhinged. She's like, "What is going on right now? Why is he eating asparagus?" And it totally worked. It 100% worked. So,
well, and I think, like you said, have the conversations too. That's one thing. It was never, when I was a kid, it was never a choice or a conversation. It's like, the food's on your plate, you're going to eat the food, or we're going to sit here until you do. Mm-hmm. And now, like, asparagus is perfect. Like, I'm not a fan of asparagus in many forms, right? But or really vegetables at all. But like, there are different ways. And so we have the conversation there. Well, let's cook it a different way. And so my wife makes asparagus. She wraps it in bacon and puts like brown sugar on it. That's like a totally different thing. Like, that's 100%. Like, this is the same thing you said you didn't like last week. Yep. Well, I love it now. I'm like, see, so it's not the thing that you hate. Maybe it's just the way
it's prepared. Absolutely. Do you remember they used to steam Brussels sprouts? We always had steamed Brussels sprouts. Gross. But if you fry Brussels sprouts or like oven roast them and drizzle them with olive oil and cracked salt, you're like, this is delicious.
It's a completely different vegetable.
The first time I ever had it where it was cooked that way, I was like, wait, I grew up my whole life thinking I didn't like Brussels sprouts. No, I don't like steamed Brussels sprouts. That is disgusting.
It's like epiphany.
Yep. So tell me more about some of these like little changes. So for example, you're like, hey, you guys want to eat at the table? You don't want to eat at the table. You're not feeling it. You are feeling it. I'm not going to make it a big deal. And ironically, the three that are younger are like, hey, we'll eat anything. Let's go. And the older ones are kind of a little bit more picky. So, but what are some of the other differences if you're, now that you're doing it again?
I think, I don't know. I think the biggest difference really, and it comes out in a myriad of ways, is I think in a lot of ways, I just relax. I was so worried about perception. That was a big one too. As a young parent in my as a 20-year-old parent, we were at our first duty station. Many of our friends at the time were 5 years older than us. The kids were the same age, but they were significantly older than us, because we had started early. And we were involved with the church. And so I felt like when we were out in public, there was a perception that we had to present a picture.
Right.
And so there was a lot of time spent like enforcing, like, don't do that, sit still, be quiet, those kind of things. Because I was worried about how everybody cared about whether I was right. Like, this guy can't parent his kids. He's a horrible. And I think as I grew up, I just realized I don't. And this sounds like you always say, oh, who cares what people think? Everybody cares what people think,
Right.
even today. But I was just less concerned now. I'm like, I've raised 3 kids. And so maybe I've already, like when you skydive, like I've already survived one jump. The second jump isn't as scary as the first jump.
Right. Interesting.
I know I can do this. So instead of just doing it the same way, I'm going to try different. So we go out in public now. I really care less about, I really do. I really care less. And I try to seize like different. So we walked out of Target. This is several months ago down here. And there was a guy, he was playing, what was he playing? A violin, I think it was, for money. And we walked out of Target and I scooped up she was 2 at the time. I scooped her up and just danced with her right there on the sidewalk. I never would have done that. I never would have done that before. I would have been too afraid of people looking at me, judging me. And now I'm like, I just don't. She laughed. And that moment, like, she was having so much fun. I ended up walking over. I gave the dude like $50 because all I had in my wallet, which I'm sure he blew his mind. But I was just so grateful. There's so many moments I didn't seize because I was scared how I would look or how people would judge us the first go around. And I regret that. I try to make sure now if the kids want to play, if the kids are like, we want to do silly stuff out in public or we're going to have fun, then we're going to have fun. And I try to not let other people's perceptions impede that as much, which is a big shift for me.
I'm resonating so deeply because I definitely fall into that category of can easily care too much about what people think. Right. And I remember this, especially with my 17-year-old, is like, when you said that, sit still, be quiet. I remember so much of that. I remember, don't put your hands like that. Don't touch people with that. Your hands are dirty right now. Go wash your hands, and it was just constant micromanagement on a child who like doesn't even
That's a good word.
Say again.
That's a good word. Micromanagement.
Yeah. And it was just too much management. And especially, and this is the distinction that I just wrote down, that I'm like, man, this really hits home. Did I care more about what others think than how my child felt?
I did.
But that's a tough place.
If you had asked me at the time, though, I don't think I would have. I think I would have rationalized it with this idea that, well, I'm trying to teach my kids, how to behave in public or whatever.
Right.
Instead of thinking, and not every lesson I have to teach my kid is the lesson. Like, the lesson is the whole totality of childhood. At some point, the parents, like, I follow your stuff on there, but I follow all these different dad groups or Life of Dad or Dads Helping Dads. And the ones that really I aspire are the ones that look like they want to have fun, like with their kids. And I see them, there aren't a whole lot sometimes out in public, but you really see the dads that are engaged, that are like totally like they have a new baby, and you just see the dad. Or the ones I love are when they're out in a restaurant and the dad is like engrossed in this conversation with the child.
Yes.
And it isn't like, oh, stop talking to me, or this is adults are talking. Like, it's like, you know what? I don't care if adults are talking. What do you have to say? Like, I want to know. And I love it. Like, I'm like, that's what I want to be like. And I'm like, I talk to people every day. I talk to my wife probably more than she cares for me to. So when my 3-year-old wants to talk, like, I'm like, well, what? Like, how was your day? Like, I want to know. Even if she's going to tell me some shenanigans before I painted or whatever, I'm like, I still want to know. But I wasn't like that before. I was very much like, hey, we're out. Dad's talking. You need to be quiet. Instead of saying, hey, you know what? Like, dad's having a conversation with a friend, but you can be part of this conversation too. I know you may be 5 or 6 or 10 or 15, but you can what you have to say still has value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was actually, I read a really article that hit me yesterday, or not an article, a letter. It was on a Life of Mom that had gotten reposted, and it was talking about validating your kids' feelings. And that one hit me. It's like, just because you're 3 or 8 or 27, what you have to say does have value. And it shouldn't just be silenced because dad's having a conversation with somebody else, or dad's watching Superman, by the way, which is on television.
This statement, the real parenting lessons, the totality of the parenting experience, or whatever. I'm not saying it perfectly, but when you said that, it's like, wow, that's it. Like, we need to gain more perspective. Like, it's not this little moment, it's everything. It's the whole thing. It's not this small shenanigan or that little moment where, they spilled something or they did that. That's not the lesson. The lesson is all of it. It's how teaching them how to live.
I think if that moment becomes the lesson, then you probably messed the moment up. If your kid spilled something, I remember spilling something as a kid and watching my mom lose it like completely. And the lesson I took out of that was that's irrational. Like, really? But I think sometimes, as a dad, you're in the moment. Like, it's almost like I'm in the forest. I can't see the trees. And so, but I step back and I look at those times I spent with my dad. And I'm like, the moments were not the times when he was correcting me or not. It was those all the other moments, the drives that we would take and the conversations that we would have. And I'm like, and so when I look at my kids, I'm realizing like the moment is the whole spectrum of them growing up. It isn't just this moment of you have to eat this. And as an adult, I go to a restaurant, I don't eat. If I don't like it, I'm not going to eat it. So why I'm teaching my kid, what are the lessons I want to teach my kids? Like, I want them to be compassionate. I want them to be, I want them to reach out and help friends. I want them to be hard workers. I want them to be these lessons. And I can teach those lessons without having to do everything that my grandparents did, or maybe my parents did. Maybe there's different ways of doing it that make it more enjoyable for everybody, including myself. I don't know. And that's kind of how I look at it. And I think a lot of it is just being engaged. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, I have that mental picture in my head of this dad just like engrossed in this conversation with his toddler. And that's kind of what I want to be like. I want to just.
This is the thing is, it's what you're talking about something. There's so much wisdom in what you're talking about. And I know, and it's like easy to overlook. What you're saying is, look, the depth of your connection, the validating of their existence, the confidence that you inspire within them by literally giving them the emotional, like that eye-to-eye contact, that picking them up and dancing when the music's playing, that teaching them how to be alive and not sweat small things, not make small things bigger than they need to be, I don't think it can be understated. And what's very interesting, I remember I sat in a class and it was taught by a man who worked in the special ed, and he had been in there for a long time. He'd been, this guy's a veteran of special education, but he didn't work in special education with just mentally handicapped children or physically handicapped children. He worked in special education with emotionally troubled children. And he was often put in the different programs to help these kids, like in pilot programs and stuff, where they were trying to get kids that were emotionally unregulated to be able to get educated, because the schools have a responsibility to make sure the child could be educated, but the teachers couldn't educate these kids because they were out of control. Mm-hmm. And he told me something that was really interesting, and it absolutely is resonating with what you're saying, which is, he said in this class that we need to pay attention to our connection to correction ratio. That if we correct our child more often than we deeply connect with them, then we will rub the relationship wrong and we will experience challenges with them. And then you will see power struggles. You will see emotional outbursts. You will see pushback where you're like, dude, why are you pushing back right now? There's no, like, I'm asking you to put your shoes on. It's not really like, why is this the fight, And so he's like telling us that we'll come out sideways. So you have to pay attention to, like, hey, are you connecting? Are you making sure you're connecting often? Because a lot of these children that he said he'd had in these programs, They had very little connection. Most of the world had rejected them. Most teachers had isolated them. Most people had put them in the back of the class, said you need to be quiet, put them outside of the class. You can imagine that maybe their parents, maybe it was a single parent. And if they're a single parent, they're so busy trying to care for this child and the other parent's gone. And so they're trying to do all this work and manage all the duties and manage all the family responsibilities. They had no time for the kid, this emotional time for them. So these kids turn out to feel like rejects, and then they act out. And so the misconception is these kids need more correction. When in reality, these kids need more connection. They needed to be connected with, they need to be validated and seen and treated differently. And he said that whenever he developed a deep connection, when he brought the kid in and was just like, hey man, I get it. You're going to throw all this stuff. I know you're going to basically try to test me. I get that, but I just want to know you. I just want to make sure that I know who you are. Like, what are you about? And he said, when he did that, everything would flip on its head.
Well, that's funny because it's logical when you say it. I mean, like all of that, you like, yeah, that makes sense. I think every dad will go, well, yeah, totally, I get that. But it's still hard because I think it's hard to be vulnerable as a parent. I think it's hard because we don't know. Like I know it's uncomfortable to like hug your kids sometimes, or especially as they get older and it's a son. Like, but I still do it. Like. But I think it's logically, it's easy for a man to go yes, or a father to go yes. All of that I get. That makes perfect sense. And you're okay, well, now go connect. And you're like, well, but he needs to put his shoes on. And you're like, well, you're getting baited into the fight. And it is. I was sitting while you were talking about that, I was like, that sounds just like Good Will Hunting. There's a whole scene where he's sitting on the bench and he's like, talking about all this stuff, and he's like, but you've never left Boston, you've never done these things, you don't know, like you can tell me all this stuff and you can fight against me, everything. He's like, but there's nothing I can't learn about you that I couldn't read in a book unless you want to talk to me. And that's one of my favorite parts where he says, he's like, if you're not willing to connect with me, then I everything else, I'm like, whatever, I can go read all the psychology books in the world, but I still have to get down on my knees and spend the time with my kid. And I think sometimes that's the challenge. And especially if you're busy and you're like, I'm working, my wife works, I'm in a good place now, I'm retired. So, and I have a good job. So we have a little bit more money than I have ever had in my life. So it's a little easier. I have more time. But to find that time and go, I need to connect. I need to spend that time. I was just talking about our two younger girls. I was like, I want to make a point to take them out, just me and one of them, to do whatever, even if we just go walk around the mall with my 8-year-old, but just to spend time with her. And then another day I'll just spend time with the 3-year-old. And then obviously the baby, as he gets older, I'm like, but you have to make the time.
Yeah, you have to. And
have to get down on the floor.
And I remember, a really great, because it's easy to think, man, we gotta make, for example, a trip out of it, or I've got to go spend this one-on-one time, which is amazing, by the way. The memories are incredible. Definitely do that. And something that I've learned about this connection idea that I think it's easy to miss is like, it can be so small. When you wink at a child, when you're sitting across the table and you just give them a little wink, a smile and a wink, or you silently look at them and you silently in your own mind say, I love you,
Yeah.
and you do these small things. You tap them on the shoulder. You kind of poke them when you're walking in the kitchen. It's like these tiny little things that says, hey, I love you. I see you're here. I acknowledge you. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It can be that small too, right? It's like just even little bitty moments of just those things and just making sure that we're getting those. And one last thing on this. And this is, I think it was Jane Nelson who said this. And I remember, man, that's so good. She said, children who feel good do better. And children who feel worse do worse. If your child's not feeling good about who they are, not feeling comfortable in an environment, not feeling confident, not feeling like they belong, not feeling like they can contribute in a meaningful way, not feeling like they know how to plug in, guess what? You're probably going to see them do some really bizarre things. They're not going to act the way you think they should act. and so much of it, you see a child that's confident, that has this radiant confidence and stuff. And it's like, that takes emotional connection. It takes helping a child feel connected and special so that they can go out in the world and be connected and special.
Yeah. And I think what you said is interesting. It's looking at that compendium of the whole childhood. Sometimes I think that as much like we plan the trips or the whatever, I think the day-to-day ends up being the more important.
Right.
If it builds up, like, because my folks are both passed away. And so I look back and a lot of this parenting is selfish. Like I want when I'm older to have really good relationships with my kids. My father was my hero. And we had a great relationship. I didn't move in with him until I was 15 or 16 years old. And I didn't really know him, and we built this relationship. And I want to have this. So it's somewhat selfish. Like, I don't want my kids to grow up and hate me because I yell at them all the time. Like, there's some self-servingness to it too. But I look back and I think about the times when my dad told me he was proud of me, which I can think of like one. Not that he wasn't. I just don't remember him ever saying it, other than like one time when I left to go to the military. And so I tried to, like, this morning is a great example. My 8-year-old woke up on the wrong side of the bed. She was just kind of giving some attitude. And my initial reaction was to kind of to bite, like, hey, I don't want that attitude. And so she stormed upstairs, and I went up and I'm doing stuff, and I was walking by and I stopped and I walked back. And normally 20-year-old me, I would have kept going because I'm right. How dare she cop that attitude? How dare she?
Right.
And this time I walked back and I was like, hey, Ari. She's like, yeah. And I go, I love you. And she's like, hey, I love you too. And like the whole day shifted. Like, it went a completely different direction.
Right.
Because she was just being 8. Like, and I could have just hammered like I would have in the past. Yeah. But I think now, like, it's those little moments to stop and be like, hey, I love you. Or, hey, how was your dad? Always try to ask these 3, even the 3-year-old, how was your day? Did you have a good day? She's like, good day. I'm like, okay, cool. That's all I'm going to get from a 3-year-old. But I try to, like, engage and be like, hey, how was your day? I want to know about your day. What did you do in class? Like, how was it? How were these things? How was your friend? Like, all of these things. And I didn't do all that stuff the first time. And I wish I had. I think it would have been probably a more enjoyable childhood for all of us. But I don't know. I think it's sometimes it's the little things, and you have to build the habit patterns and the thought process of being like, hey, you know what? And I apologize. That's, I think, is the other big thing. I never remember my mom apologizing. My mom, the reason we lived with my grandparents is my mom always had issues. And so my mom would fly off the handle. Like we talked before, outside the podcast, I think anger, which I had a lot of, and I still do, it's a learned behavior. And my sister and I lived in fear. Like, she worked at night. So if you woke her up during the day, that was not going to end well. Like, somebody was going to be hit. It was bad. And so we lived in fear. And then when she would fly out the handle, even if she was wrong, she never came back and said, hey, I'm sorry. Right. And so I tried. I'm like, look, hey, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled at you. You know, I know you're having a bad day. I'm not. And that's humbling, I think, when you're the adult and you're having to apologize to an 8-year-old. But again, it's learned behavior. I want her to sit there and go, hey, we all have bad days. But what did I see my parents do? Like, I saw my parents, yeah, they're not perfect. Sometimes they yelled, sometimes they lost control, but they always came back and apologized after. And then maybe someday when she's an adult, she's in a scenario, she'll learn that being able to apologize when you're wrong is something that human beings just aren't very good at.
Yeah, absolutely. The self-preserving part of us does not want to do that.
No, like, my pride wants to, you didn't do anything wrong.
Even in the middle of you apologize, and I should speak for myself here. In the middle of me apologizing, I often want to say, you know, I'm super sorry I did that, and I really didn't handle things well. And, you know, it's when you do that thing, you know, and I go back and return back to a point where I'm kind of doing the blame thing again. And I've caught myself where it's like, you know, honestly, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter what you did. The truth is that it doesn't matter really what you did. It really matters how I handled it. I didn't handle it well. I want to get back into integrity with the dad I want to be, the person I want to be. And I want you to know, dude, I love you. And I am sorry. I'm sorry I handled things that way.
Yeah.
It took me I love what you're saying about it being a learned behavior. And my father, he knows, and so does my mother, that, you know, certainly the anger that I expressed on my son was coming, is a learned behavior, absolutely learned. And, today I actually help dads. Anger is one of the primary things I help dads with. And I sure hope that nobody goes on my page or nobody ever sees me and goes, "Oh, this guy who's always been perfect is teaching people." It's like, no, 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 no. I am teaching from literally the place of zero. Like I started at ground zero, worse than almost anybody in terms of managing anger, working with discipline and all those things. And I'm on the other side. That's why I'm trying to help dads get through, because I wasted years of heartache and frustration and way over managing and way over correcting and just being constantly berating my child with sarcasm and with all kinds of, different things that were extremely discouraging. They were discouraging. I was constantly discouraging. I remember my father, they would come and they would, the waitress would say, "Can I get you guys any drinks for, and everybody say, "Yeah, I'll have a glass of iced tea. I'll have this. What do you kids have?" And I'd be like, "Dad, can I have a soda?" And he'd say, "Yeah, I guess you can have a Coke." And then they would say, "Lids?" And before us kids could respond, "Oh, of course. Yes, lids." Like
can't trust them.
We can't trust these. You don't know these kids. And he would make these little snarky comments. My dad always thought he was being funny, but his sarcasm and his gestures about that stuff were terribly discouraging and they were embarrassing. We don't know this person. All of a sudden he's like throwing it out like because we've spilled the drink before, And so it was like little things like that I learned, those small moments are just so discouraging. And there's forms of overt discouragement, like when you say, "Oh, he's my troubled one," or "He's my tough one," or "He's my picky one." That's kind of overtly discouraging because you're putting a child in a frame that they can't get out of. But then there's also subtle forms of discouragement that we just don't always pick up on. And I remember whenever I enter myself in anger management, because I learned all these great parenting tools. I learned some really great stuff and I couldn't do them. It's like, I know what to do. Logically, it makes sense, but I can't seem to embody these ideas. And I remember it's like, what is the reason? It's like, I'm way triggered when he does something wrong, or when he cops the attitude, when I feel the power struggle. I am so triggered, even though I know what to do, I can't seem to do it. And I went and entered myself in anger management 12-week program. And I remember whenever I first got in the very first session, I walked in that room and I saw a bunch of degenerates in there. And I thought, I do not belong in this room right now, And boy, was I surprised whenever they handed me a clipboard. This was brilliant, by the way. They handed a clipboard to every person there. Most of these guys were in there. And as far as I understand, all of those guys were court ordered. I was the only voluntary, person in there. And they hand this clipboard around. The clipboard goes around and I get a clipboard and I'm looking at it and it says, "Have you done any of these in the anger of emotion, or in the emotion of anger?" And I look down the list and and it says like stonewalling, throwing, punching a hole, or punching things, screaming at someone, all these things. And I'm starting to look down and I'm like, oh no. I start checking boxes and I was like, wow, I almost thought I didn't belong here until I checked almost every box.
Maybe I am in the right room.
Maybe I do belong here. And one of the biggest takeaways, and I'll kind of wrap I shouldn't even be talking this long, but I'm not the person being interviewed here, but I'm doing a terrible job here. But one of the things that happened, I think this was really my big takeaway, is I learned how to make a repair, which is what you inspired this for me. My personal experience here is you learn how to make a repair. And a repair is saying, hey, I messed up. I didn't live in integrity with the kind of person I want to be. I didn't treat you with the kind of actions that I want to treat you with, or the kind of behaviors I want to treat you with. And I want to make a repair, and I want to get back in alignment with who I want to be, and apologize for who I was. Right. And so what I learned is that if you're willing to make repairs as quickly as you can emotionally possibly do it.
Yes.
And make sure you don't let one slip. You don't just let it go by. You really own it. You really do it. when I first started doing this, I had to make a repair almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And that was terrible. And it was tough because my body and my brain were like, I do not want to do this. I'm tired of saying I'm sorry. But the more that I made those repairs, the less often I had to make them. And eventually it got to a point where I only had to make a repair like once every month. And then it got to a point where I was only making a repair once every quarter. And then got to a point where I was like, wow, I've gone like 6 months without flying off the handle. This is actually working. Repairs was huge to that process. Absolutely huge.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you're talking about, in the military, everybody has a leadership book, hundreds of leadership books, and everybody reads them, and everybody tries to emulate the things that they get in the books. And I'm like, but the funny thing is, the books will tell you everything in the world, but no two leaders are even the same. If you look historically, like they all embody different things, but the one thing that they all embody is they were true to whoever they were. And I think as a 20-year-old kid who was angry and emulating a lot of what I had seen growing up, is I didn't know who I was. I was just mimicking. I was angry like my mom. I would lash out. I did all of those things on the clipboard. Screamed, yelled, punched holes in walls, like lose control, eat your food, very regulated. And it wasn't, well, over the course of time, but I think it really wasn't until several years ago that I realized that I can't, just the anger specifically, and not just with the kids, but with everything. It was tearing apart every relationship I had because I was so angry all the freaking time, like the tiniest things at work, at home, my wife, my ex-wife, everything, like just the tiniest things. And I want to throw things across the room. And while I had figured out how to control the physical thing, like you wouldn't see me react in anger, I didn't hit things. I was seething inside. And so it took me there's a lot, but it took me a lot to kind of figure out that I can't. First one, I have little babies now. I want to live as long as I can. I can't live like that, like just being angry all the time. And so, I had to let go of a lot of things. And then when it came to parenting, I realized I had to let go of a lot of things. I had to let go of all these preconceived ideas and all these books that were like, oh, a good parent does this or good. Who do I want to be as a parent? Like, I can take this tool from this book and then that tool from that book, but that one really doesn't apply to me, but I really want to do this one. And it took a lot, and it was not just parenting, but it was with my work. It was with my relationships now with my wife and my kids. And, but the anger it'll destroy everything. It like lays waste to everything around you. And it took me so long to get that. And the worst part is, and this breaks my heart, is sometimes I see that in my oldest child. I see that same anger, and I know it's learned, and I can't fix that. I wish I could. We talk about it, me and her, but I'm just like, sometimes you see the damage that you do and you can't go back and you can't fix it. And you can try to make it right. And you have those open conversations, but sometimes I hate that and I look back, but I can't fix it. But I don't want to be like that again. And I think that's, so in those moments when I want to lash out because I think it's like an addiction too. Like it never goes away. Like that anger it's right there. I was like, I can pick it up anytime. I've just learned how to deal with it.
Well, they say it's not called anger resolution. It's called anger management.
I like that. That's true.
It's almost impossible to resolve it. You will feel triggered about things, but you've got to learn how to manage it. And this is such a great analogy. And I'm like, man, this is something I want. It's like an ideal that I want to live in and embody. And it's more going to be a practice because you can't do it perfectly. But the idea that have mind like water. Have you ever heard of this?
Yes.
Someone throws in a pebble in the water will come and respond by a pebble's ripple. They throw a boulder in and a boulder's ripple.
Yep.
But us angry men, it could be a pebble and we give a boulder ripple.
The boulder, yeah, every time.
And we don't settle down. That's the other thing too, is as the boulder, you throw a pebble in the water, the ripples work their way out and then they smooth out. Sometimes someone throws a pebble in, we have a boulder experience, and then we don't let it smooth out. We just keep on keeping on.
Churn.
Yeah, we just keep churning.
I think it's almost like the Hulk. Like I think it does feel good
right
when you're angry. Like you feel in control. Like you feel like you're not. I think that the idea of I'm watching Superman. Sorry, so I've got this the Hulk. Like it's like the Hulk. Like he lashes out. Yep. He's like and it feels good. It does in that moment.
It's hard to get it back in.
Yeah, well, and then you realize afterwards, like you have to deal with the damage that is left, whether it's as easy a hole patching a hole in the wall, but the worst damage is looking at your kids and seeing, them having to see you like that. And I think that's the worst part is
Absolutely.
you can't clean that up.
Mm-hmm.
That also, like those little moments of I love yous and how was your days, those little moments carry too. And I realized with my parents, my grandparents, amazing people, but imperfect. I think you hope that your kids grow to a point in life where they look back and they go, you know what, my parents weren't perfect, but they did the best they could with what they had.
Yep.
And my parents came from stunted. My dad especially came from a very, very stunted relationship. I mean, at one point, my grandparents actually took him and his brothers and put him in an orphanage in the same town that they lived in, and then came to
Oh,
visit them. And they would visit them at the orphanage. Like, how messed up is that?
wow. Can you
So
imagine the emotional pull on that?
yeah, and I'm like, I just to look back and go, you know what? Well, I won't be like that, but I hope that my kids look back and go, you know what? I love my dad, and I think he did the best he could, and
I have
maybe
a,
they'll be one step better than me.
yeah. I want to ask you this, and then I'll make this like my final question. Do your older kids see your changes, and do they feel like, did they have this like, look at dad, he's kind of growing up, kind of going as, how do they take the changes?
Um, so first, when I got remarried, and then we had a baby, they progressively too, from the top down, they didn't react as well. I think that when I had gotten remarried and you saw my life move on, it was hard for them. We had a lot of good conversations though, because that was my big thing. It's not moving on. Like to me, so I grew up, and it was so funny that I had a cousin, and she'd always be like, for her, she grew up, and it was like, if I'm 100% of something and you're getting 51%, then I must be getting 49% of it. But love doesn't work that way. Like that's completely the opposite. Like the idea that now that I have three younger kids, is somehow I'm going to love them more or love them differently. Like, and so we had a lot of conversations, and it's fun now. My 23-year-old was just down here for the holidays visiting with her now fiance. And it was fun because like we had those conversations, and they're like, man, like you're different, like you're the same dad. Um, but we see like a lot of difference, like the playing and the relaxation, and of course the younger ones are much more spoiled than the older three were, because I have more money now than I did then.
Right.
But there's no bitterness there. It's almost kind of like the old man's kind of mellowed out,
Yeah.
and
They
they give me a hard
it's
time
probably a
about it.
little bit of a sweet thing, I would imagine, where they get to see their dad's evolution and kind of live a little vicariously through the kids, or
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. I hope that's the case. I love that they come down, and so I have this picture on my desk, and it's all six, and I'm always trying to strive to get the pictures of all of them, and then to have those moments, especially like now I got the two boys and I get the four girls, and I always try to get these things, but I want them to be kind of spontaneous too, because I hate staged pictures. Um, and it's amazing to watch them, the older three, grab onto these younger three, to like they love them with everything they have. And it's, to me, that's I couldn't have asked for anything more, to know that though the older three, just they're like, oh, these are like my step siblings or my half siblings or whatever, that these are like
right.
these are my little brother, little sisters, and they love
These
them.
are my blood.
Yeah, and they love them, and they take control of them. So I
That's
try to
awesome.
capture those moments, and then I tried to now it took me a long time to get into social media, but now I try to take opportunities to like lift my kids up, to because I think that's what we should do as dads too, right? Like to elevate and to put them out, like when they're like, here's a stage, I'm gonna push you out there because you're ready. You don't think you're ready, but I'm gonna put you in that spotlight for a minute, and I'm gonna tell the world how great you are. And so I do that, like my daughter just graduated from esthetician school, um, which I had to look up even how to spell. But I went nuts on Facebook. I'm like, look at this amazing kid. She's so amazing. And she's like, da, 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 da. And oh my gosh, like here she is. And here's this huge pedestal on Facebook. And I'm gonna sing your praises. And I do it for all of them on their birthdays or some big things. And I'm sure all of my friends are tired of it. But I'm like that. I don't know. I just want them to know how proud I am of them. I look back, I guess that's things I wish I had had more of growing up. Like, whether it was football games or wrestling matches or track, my folks never really went. They never really, like, even if I'd medal or I'd do something really good, like they were kind of like, I think my parents were ready to be empty nesters. By the time we were there, so they were always off doing whatever. And I don't know, I always kind of like, I missed having my folks, my dad around during those big moments. And so I always want to be like, hey, that's awesome. I'll drive all the way up to Wichita and be there for your graduation and be there for these big moments and have you guys come down here. And so, yeah, I hope the older three look and kind of just probably chuckle at the different styles I use now versus what they got.
Yeah, that's awesome. Jerod, this has been so good. I've been super inspired, man. It's really, really cool to hear your story and to hear what it's like to do it twice. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of dads are getting a lot of this. I know I certainly have, and I resonate deeply with the changes in perspective, what you've made important, what you've let go of. And yeah, just honored to be here with you. And I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Guys, if you enjoyed this episode, please do like and subscribe and share with your friends, like we mentioned. And yeah, have a beautiful and blessed day. And we'll see you in the next episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you've received some value from it, please share it with other dads and consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll see you in the next episode. Looking for support with your fatherhood journey? Go to bedadly.com and take our Dadly Disposition quiz and learn helpful insights on how you can overcome power struggles with your kids.